Have you ever just felt like, like there's this hidden logic to things, like stuff going on under the surface that shapes what we believe?
Yeah, definitely. Like there are these invisible forces kind of pulling the strings.
Right. And that's what we're going to dive into today, like how those unseen forces might be at work.
Cool. Sounds interesting.
So the material for this deep dive, it's a bit out there. It's called, and I'm just going to read the title here, Magic Practices to Create Dystopian Belief Systems.
Okay. Wow. That's quite a title.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But it's more intriguing than it sounds. Like at first glance, you might think it's fantasy or something.
Yeah.
But as I was looking it over, it's got some really interesting theories. Like it connects these historical figures, certain practices, to the idea that, well, that reality might be manipulated.
Okay, so not just fantasy then. More like, I don't know, some people actually believe this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And it uses authors like Tracy Twyman, figures like John Dee, and even stuff like the cult of Mithras and Gnosticism.
Lots of different threads there.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure. And that's our goal today, to make sense of it all.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so right off the bat, we see John Dee's name. So for anyone who's not familiar with him, who was this guy?
Okay, so John Dee, he was he was a pretty important guy back in Elizabethan England. Like he was the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I.
An astrologer.
Yep. But here's the thing. He wasn't just some court astrologer. I mean, he was also super into alchemy. And get this, he was the guy behind Enochian ritual magic.
Enochian ritual magic? That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah. He claimed, and this is where it gets really interesting, that angels, like actual angels, revealed this magic system to him through scrying, of all things.
So angels, alchemy, and a queen. Not your average resume.
No, not at all.
And the source we're using, it mentions this theory that Dee might have even become this kind of, I don't know, mythological figure. It connects him to like Uranos, so even the Hindu god Vishnu. That's a huge jump, right?
Yeah, it is. But think about it this way. The source is looking at Dee's influence beyond just the historical stuff. Like take Oannes, for example.
Who was Oannes again?
He was this Babylonian god.
Yeah.
The god who brought civilization wisdom, especially astronomy.
Okay, and Dee?
And Dee was like insanely important for how people understood astronomy back then. He was like pioneering new ways to even observe the stars. So the connection, it's not saying Dee was a god literally.
Right.
It's more about like similarity in their roles. They both brought knowledge specifically about the cosmos.
So both bringers of cosmic knowledge in a way.
Right.
I get that. And the source also mentions Dee and, well, his ability to manipulate light to make these 3D projections. I mean, how does that tie into, shaping reality?
It's interesting, right? I mean, he wasn't just, studying the stars. He was actually experimenting with light perception, like how they work together to create like illusions of reality.
So it's like he was messing with like the very building blocks of how we see things.
I think that's the point. The source is suggesting that maybe this fascination Dee had with illusions, it ties into, well, this bigger idea of how we create belief systems, how we build up our idea of reality.
Okay. So the source is painting Dee as like, I don't know, not just this astrologer, but someone who is playing with the very nature of what's real, which I guess makes sense if we're talking about how someone could make like a dystopian belief system, right? Like how would they control what people see, what they believe?
Right, exactly.
And now that we're on that track, there's this whole thing about Vishnu and his 3 steps across the universe. How does the source connect that to Dee?
Okay, so with Vishnu, it's all symbolic.
Yeah.
Right? The source is interpreting those 3 steps as like a way of mapping or even creating the 3-dimensional world.
Okay, so like defining the boundaries of reality.
Yeah, and Dee, I mean, he was really focused on understanding 3D. He even tried to create artificial 3D experiences. So again, it's like aligning Dee with this figure who, in mythology, literally shaped reality.
So it's about Dee's focus on like the very structure of the world. I'm starting to see the pattern here.
Yeah. The groundwork, the foundations, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Okay, and speaking of foundations, we got to talk about Monas Hieroglyphica. This is described as Dee's like secret formula to recombine the universe's elements, like to create a whole new universe, the monad, and potentially to even undo the old one. That's a pretty big claim.
It is, yeah. It's this idea that a universe could be kind of replaced by another one. And the source, it actually brings up similar ideas later on, like with the cult of Mithras,
Right.
where there's this whole thing about a new cosmic order being established through sacrifice.
Oh, right. So there's this recurring theme of one reality being replaced with another. It's like an echo throughout the source.
Exactly. One reality giving way to another.
Okay, back to Monas Hieroglyphica.
Yeah.
The source says it's based on these 3 elements, or dimensions. They represent metals and the 7 classical planets. And then get this, it compares it to a motherboard. A computer motherboard. That seems so random. What's the point of that?
Okay, so think about it like this. The metals, they're like the basic forces, the building blocks.
Like the raw materials?
Yeah. And then the planets, their alignments. They're like the circuits, the organizing principles. The source is basically saying that Dee thought you could, like, rewire the universe.
Like change the code, the programming.
Yeah, something like that, to create a new operating system for reality.
Yeah.
The motherboard is just a way to visualize that, I guess, like how you can rearrange these basic components to make a whole different outcome.
Oh, okay. Now I'm seeing it. And then there's this mention of Dee in 1604 announcing something to the queen, some big secret. And then the source, out of nowhere, jumps to the Cullinan diamond, discovered in 1905, and how it was split up. That's like 300 years later. What's going on there? What connection are they making?
Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, the source is kind of vague about it, but it seems to be suggesting that this secret Dee it played out over a really long time. And the diamond, its appearance and then being divided, it's like this symbolic event, like a consequence of Dee's work.
Like ripples through time. That's really interesting.
Right. But it's also kind of frustrating because the source doesn't really explain, like, how exactly they're connected.
Yeah, that's true. But it does add this whole other layer of mystery. Like maybe there's this very long-term plan unfolding, at least according to the source.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about this idea of a supplanted universe, or an overlaid one. The source actually argues that it's not a complete replacement, more like this false overlay or system being built. What's the difference? Like, why is that distinction so important?
Okay, so the key difference is that, according to the source, our fundamental reality isn't being totally erased. Like, it's not being deleted and replaced. It's more like someone is building something on top of it.
Like an extra layer.
Yeah, an artificial layer that influences how we see the world, how we interact with it. Yeah. The source calls it a magical act or a program, creating this false overlay.
Okay, so this overlay is shaping our experience, but not replacing the whole thing.
Right, that's the idea.
And the source says the tree of Kabbalah is like the capstone holding this false system in place. Why the Kabbalah?
Well, the tree of Kabbalah, it's this really complex symbolic representation of the universe, the divine. It's got all these intricate connections. So by calling it the capstone, the source is implying that this overlay, it's not just some random thing, it's built with a specific structure, purpose.
Like it's designed, not just accidental.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe even drawing on these esoteric principles for stability, or even for the very framework of the overlay.
And then the source uses this analogy I thought was pretty clever, of a painting. Like a painting where someone's changing things, but we don't notice because we're so distracted by, entertainment. What do you think that's getting at?
I think it's about attention, right? Like if we're constantly focused on, I don't know, the flashy surface level stuff, we might miss the changes happening underneath.
The subtle changes to the bigger picture.
Right, yeah. The source is really emphasizing awareness, like being critical, paying attention.
And it says, the magic show needs an audience. Like our belief, our willingness to just accept these illusions, that's what makes them work. It even mentions David Copperfield.
It's true, though, right?
Yeah.
Any illusion, whether it's on stage or, well, a belief system, it needs people to buy into it, to believe it.
Like our collective belief, it becomes the power that shapes reality.
I think that's what the source is getting at, yeah.
Okay, this is where it gets a bit, all over the place. It briefly mentions some religious stuff, like Mormonism and how they believe in creating your own universe, Buddhism's Bardos, Hinduism with all its gods. And then randomly, it brings up Mark Hoffman, the guy who forged all those Mormon documents. It feels like a non sequitur. What's the point?
Yeah, it's a weird jump, I agree. But I think the source is trying to show like the huge range of beliefs about creation and reality. Huh? And then with Hoffman, it's like, okay, but what about authenticity?
Like, how can we be sure what's real, what to believe?
Exactly. It makes us question, like, the foundations of any belief system. How do we know what's genuine?
That's a great point. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, The source connects smart cities to this idea of, like, artificial worlds being layered on top of the real one. I mean, that's a pretty interesting parallel, right?
Yeah, definitely. Smart cities with all the tech, the sensors, the data, it's like they're creating this digitally mediated environment. And the source is saying, well, that's a real-world example of this overlay idea.
Like, our experience is being shaped by these systems we've built.
Right. These systems that are working within the world, but also kind of on top of it.
Yeah.
And they affect how we perceive things, how we interact with the city.
It's like a layer of technology on top of the physical world.
Exactly.
Okay, and then the source mentions this pillar in Solomon's temple, the one held by Asmodeus, which represents punishment. And it compares it to Hercules and Atlas holding up the world. What's the connection? What do these pillars mean for our discussion?
Those pillars, they're all about the forces that uphold the current reality, right? Like Asmodeus and his pillar, it's about control, coercion, keeping things in place through force.
Through punishment, even.
Yeah.
And Hercules, Atlas, it's more about, like, raw power, brute strength.
Exactly. So whether it's through punishment or just sheer strength, those pillars represent the idea that maintaining a certain reality, it takes effort, it takes influence.
Whether that influence is real or just, in our heads.
Right.
And then the source contrasts two views. Albert Mackey, who saw the keystone as representing the natural order of the universe, and Fulcanelli, who rejected that idea and said it's all a simulacrum.
Yeah,
that seems like a really important difference.
Yeah, it gets to the heart of the matter, I think. Like, is the universe ordered naturally, or is it this artificial construct, a simulacrum, as Fulcanelli called it?
A copy, an imitation.
Right, and that's the question the source keeps coming back to. Are we living in something genuine or something that's been crafted, made to look real?
That's a really big question.
It is.
And then it gets even more mind-bending. The source brings up the simulated universe idea and how believing in that can lead to, well, solipsism, the idea that a person can become God. What's the link there?
Well, if reality is a simulation, right, and if it's maybe controlled by someone's consciousness, then that person, they have ultimate power. They're like a god in that reality.
Because they're controlling the simulation.
Yeah. And that leads to solipsism, because if everything's a simulation, maybe only your own mind is real. Everything else is just a product of your mind.
Wow, that's getting pretty deep. And the source mentions, like, magicians who claim that becoming a god means destroying the old universe to create a new one, and that this leads to chaos.
It's like this ultimate act of creation, but also destruction. And I guess the chaos part, that's the potential consequence. Like, what happens when someone tries to remake reality from scratch? It could be unpredictable, dangerous.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it seems like the source is saying that this idea of a completely fake world, it's a trap, a dangerous belief. But it also says that the overlay, the system, that's real. And it's based on these, these flawed ideas.
Yeah, that's the crucial distinction. It's not that everything is fake. It's more like the way we understand things, the systems we live in, they've been manipulated.
Influenced by these ideologies that might not be so good for us.
Exactly. And the source is saying it's important to recognize that manipulation, to see the systems for what they are, but not to just give up and say, oh, it's all fake anyway.
Right, because then you're just giving more power to the system.
Exactly.
And how is this control maintained? The source says it's the blood and bones and beliefs of people. And get this, a soul agreement. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's pretty intense language. It's like our very existence, our beliefs, they fuel this overlay. The soul agreement, that's the really trippy part. Like, maybe on some level, we're agreeing to all of this.
Like on a subconscious level.
Yeah, maybe even before we're conscious of it. It's a pretty unsettling thought.
It is. And the source goes on to say that this overlay, it's kept going by, like, actors, false political references, polarities, corrupted creatives, movie and plastic fake personas, all this stuff in the news, the media.
It's like this constant bombardment of, I don't know, manufactured narratives.
Designed to shape how we see things.
Yeah. The source is saying that all this, it contributes to a fake sense of reality, or reality that hides or maybe even distorts the truth.
Okay, let's talk about the Gnostic influence. The source says that Gnosticism is all about believing in a false world, and that it leads to, well, self-destruction. And then it connects John Dee to the Gnostic idea of the demiurge. Can you explain all that? Like, what is Gnosticism? What's a demiurge? And how does Dee fit in?
Okay, so Gnosticism in a nutshell. It's this belief that there's a true higher God, but then there's also this lesser being, the demiurge. And this demiurge, it's often seen as flawed, maybe even evil. And the Gnostics believed the demiurge created the material world.
So our world is flawed because it was made by a flawed creator.
Yeah, that's the idea. And this material world, it's seen as a prison for our spiritual essence. Like, we're trapped here.
And the source is saying that D is like a reference or a mirror to this demiurge.
Right. It's not saying D is the demiurge, but that his actions, his whole story, it kind of reflects that Gnostic narrative.
Right.
Of a flawed creator making a flawed world.
So again, it reinforces the idea that it's not that the world itself is fake, but that the system we live in, that's the flawed creation, just like in Gnosticism.
Exactly. And the source actually uses this really strong image to describe it. It compares the overlay to a virus or an infestation.
Whoa, okay. That's a pretty disturbing image.
Yeah, but it gets the point across. Like, this overlay isn't just some harmless thing. It's insidious. It's messing with our minds, how we perceive reality. Like a parasite that's distorting our connection to the real world.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're getting into some ancient history. The source spends a lot of time on the cult of Mithras, specifically on their secret underground meetings. And their big ritual, the tauroctony, the bull-killing thing. Why is this cult so important to the source's argument?
I think the cult of Mithras, it's like this historical example of a very structured belief system. They had secrets, rituals, initiation rites, and their whole mythology, it's all about sacrifice, transformation, and how an old world is replaced with a new one.
Oh, right, that theme again.
Right. And the source is suggesting that the overlay, the system we're talking about, it might be using similar patterns, like borrowing from those ancient frameworks.
Using them as a blueprint, even.
Yeah, maybe.
And the tauroctony, the bull killing, it's connected to Taurus and Orion. Astrological stuff. What's the significance of that?
It has a cosmic element to it all, like aligning the ritual with the stars.
Right.
It could even symbolize like a shift from one astrological age to another.
Like the age of Taurus to the age of Aquarius, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And the source points this out. Taurus is also connected to like cattle and by extension to chattel, you know?
Like property.
Yeah. So there's this subtle suggestion of sacrifice, like sacrificing something for this new world order.
Like sacrificing humanity itself.
Maybe.
Yeah. And it mentions how Mithras is often depicted and compares that to the Statue of Liberty. That's a pretty weird connection. What do they have in common?
It's about the symbolism, I think. Both figures, they're kind of androgynous.
What does that mean?
Like they have both male and female qualities. And that can symbolize, a merging of opposites or like a fundamental unity. And the fact that this shows up in these totally different icons, it's suggesting that maybe there are these deeper archetypal themes at play, themes related to creation transformation.
Okay, so maybe it's not so random after all. And the whole myth of Mithras killing the bull to create a new world, usually shown with all the zodiac symbols, it really emphasizes this idea of replacing reality. And the cult of Mithras, they were all about secrecy, initiation tasks, like you had to earn your way into the deeper levels. And the source even says they were rivals with early Christianity and that Mithras was celebrated on December 25th. That's like Christmas.
Yeah, it's all really interesting stuff. The secrecy, the initiation, it points to this idea of hidden knowledge. Like there's a select group who understand the true nature of things.
Yeah.
And the rivalry with Christianity, it shows that back then, different belief systems were constantly competing, trying to win people over.
Yeah, like a battle for hearts and minds, a battle to shape reality, I guess.
Exactly.
And the connection you made earlier about Taurus and chattel, that's pretty disturbing. Like, is the source implying that humanity is being sacrificed for this new world order?
It's definitely hinting at that, like we're just resources to be used up for someone else's grand plan.
Yikes. And then it says that the whole overlay thing, the preparation, the ritual, it's all based on this model of Mithras, plus other stuff, like the Kabbalah. So it's like Mithraism is the blueprint.
That's what the source seems to be saying, yeah. Like they took the structure, the myths, the symbols of Mithraism, and combined it with other things to create this system, this overlay.
And the source even lists all these characteristics of Mithras, like from Zoroastrian and Roman beliefs. It says he's the deity of covenant, light, oath, justice, the sun, a judge at the Chinvat Bridge, protector of cattle and waters. That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it paints a picture of this incredibly powerful God, a God connected to all these fundamental aspects of life, society, the universe. So it makes sense that the Mithraic myth was so popular, it really resonated with people.
Yeah, it was a big deal back then. And the source mentions 3 versions of Mithras, like the Christian Trinity. Which again emphasizes how complex these belief systems can be.
Right. It's not just simple surface-level stuff. There are layers of meaning, different interpretations.
Okay, shifting gears again. The source introduces this concept of infinite potential abilities, like this magical power we have. And it describes the world as a giant eye, based on the idea that creation happens through light in our senses. That's a pretty abstract concept.
It is, but I think it's about how we perceive the world, right? Like the source is saying that our perception, it's not passive, it shapes reality.
Because we create the world through how we see it.
Yeah. The world is a reflection of our collective consciousness, our potential.
Okay, and this giant eye, the source says it has a cataract. What does that mean?
It's a metaphor. The cataract, it's like this blindness. The source is saying that we're blinded by our own power, our own systems.
Like the systems we created are now blocking our vision.
Exactly. It's this self-imposed limitation. We're blinded by the overlay itself.
By the system that's supposed to make things better, but is actually holding us back.
Right.
And the overlay, the source calls it predictive programming. It's locked into these material beliefs. What does that mean for how the system works, how it keeps going?
Well, I think it means that the overlay works by shaping our expectations. It makes us believe in a materialistic worldview.
Like it limits our imagination.
Yeah. It keeps us focused on the material, the tangible, and it shuts down any other possibilities. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The system creates these expectations, and then we act in ways that fulfill those expectations.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense. And now the source gets into philosophy a bit. It's pretty critical of nihilism and specifically 20th century existentialism. It calls them totally nihilistic and a sick, inverted, and heavily existentialism. Why so negative? What's the problem with these ideas?
The source is basically saying that these philosophies, especially existentialism, they focus too much on individual responsibility in a meaningless universe.
Like we're all alone and nothing really matters.
Yeah. And the source says that this leads to despair, to negativity, to this focus on how flawed and bad the world is.
Which in a way kind of echoes Gnosticism, right?
Right. And it also argues that this kind of existentialism, it promotes a false idea of free will. Like we have all these choices, but without any moral guidance.
So it's freedom without direction.
Yeah, exactly. And the source even links this to a maladaptation to minimalism, somehow perpetuating blame and negativity.
That's interesting, like simplifying your life, but in a way that makes you blame the world for everything.
Yeah, something like that. The source sees it as this cycle of negativity that keeps people trapped.
So to summarize, the belief in a completely fake world, that's a dead end, it's a trap.
Yeah.
But the systems, the ideologies, the narratives that shape how we see things, those are real, and they have a real impact on our lives.
Exactly. The source is urging us to recognize the power of these systems, to see them for what they are, but not to fall into the trap of thinking everything is just an illusion.
Because that's just giving more power to the system. And the source defines true free will, not just as choice, but as knowledge of yourself. Like knowing who you are allows you to have clearer thoughts, better intentions, and ultimately a more fulfilling life.
It's about conscious creation, like understanding yourself, your motivations, so you can make choices that align with who you really are.
That's a really powerful idea. And the source ends on this pretty intense note. It talks about the ministers of magic or misery and how they choose to perpetuate this overlay by manipulating people, especially children, to direct their energy.
Yeah, that's definitely a conspiracy theory vibe. Like there's this group of people who are intentionally controlling things.
Shaping the minds of the next generation to, I don't know, to keep the system going.
Right. Whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously, it's a pretty scary thought.
It is. Well, this has been a deep dive, that's for sure. We've explored some really complex and honestly pretty weird ideas from this source. Magic practices to create dystopian belief systems. From John Dee and the idea of a manipulated reality to ancient cults and 20th century philosophy, it's been a lot to unpack.
It has.
And just to be clear, we're not necessarily endorsing these views.
No, definitely not.
We're just trying to understand the logic, the connections the source is making.
Right, exactly, to make sense of it all.
It definitely makes you think about how powerful beliefs can be, how many different ways there are to see reality, and how these systems, these narratives can have such a huge influence on how we understand the world.
It really does. It's been fascinating and a bit unsettling at times.
For sure. So for you listening, think about this. If the world isn't totally fake, but there is this overlay, this system that's manipulating things, how does that change how you see the world? How you process information, how you react to the beliefs you encounter every day?
Yeah, something to think about.
It's a new lens to look through, a new way to navigate the complexities of, well, of everything.
I think that's a good place to leave it.